let me begin by saying, as an outsider, how important I think what you're trying to do is. We obviously confront the tragedy of the commons. You're obviously the place on campus to worry about it. And I guess part of what I want to say is, how can anybody on the outside coming in not be interested in helping you do what you're trying to do? Of course. Now, what I'm going to try to say is broader than ecological economics. And I hope that it's helpful because there's a sense in which you are one of the keepers at the University of Vermont campus, if you will, of the moral questions in our economic and political life. That's what's at the core of what you're doing, right? But those moral and political questions are wider, and I hope to get to them. I will get to them in a while, but I'm going to get us there in a funny way by talking about the work that I'm doing most recently that I'm really terribly excited about, and it's going to sound a little weird. We are in the world in a very particular way since Newton. And this sounds far from policy, but it's not. So I gave a talk on this at MIT the 19th of August, and it's online. And I'm working with a wonderful Italian-French mathematician, Giuseppe Longo, at the École Polytechnique. And he's just amazing. He really knows what he's talking about. He's a mathematician. They don't fool around. And his student male, Aya, is equally brilliant, so I'm really lucky. Let's start with Newton. So we all know, I think, apples. Oh, I gotta tell you a joke. It'll take a couple minutes. There's the physicist's theory about why apples fall to the ground, and the biologist's theory. This is totally unnecessary to the talk, but it's cute. So the physicist's argument is that apples in the center of the earth attract one another, proportional to the product of their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between their centers of mass. Biologists reason much more straightforwardly. They say, in the beginning, when apples came loose from trees, some went up, some went sideways, some went down. The ones that went down found fertile soil. Thanks to heritable variation and natural selection, apples fall down. And I love that theory. I think it's just superb, and it works for pears. It's not really good for stones. But what the heck. Anyway, back to Newton. There he is, and the apple hits him on the head. And we get 3 laws of motion. I mean, think how much Newton did. He taught us how to think. Well, so did Euler and others who came after him, but it's really Newton, who says, you know, I want to understand the trajectory of a bunch of billiard balls on the table. And he invents 3 laws of motion and universal gravitation. And he's just nice enough to invent differential and integral calculus, from which one can write down differential equations, which he taught us how to do, and Euler and Leibniz did a lot on it. Then what do? You say, Mr. Newton, or Sir Isaac, or whatever he is, how do I figure out what's going to go on with the balls on the table? He says, don't be dumb. Write down the initial conditions of position and momenta of all the balls. Write down the boundary conditions of the billiard table. Use my laws of motion to write down the differential equations of motion of the billiard balls, and integrate the equations, and you get the trajectory of the balls. But what's integration? It's deduction. And deduction is entailment. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. Aristotle's model of explanation in science. So what Newton did was mathematize Aristotle's efficient cause. And that's how we think. Okay? We are still Newtonian. And the same pattern of thought is there in Einstein, but it's also there in quantum mechanics, except that you look at the flow of a probability distribution rather than the flow of a specific trajectory. But once again, it's initial conditions, boundary conditions, ordinary or partial differential equations. Please integrate. Okay, and it's entailment. And the physicists still dream, and have for years, as Weinberg did, in Dreams of a Final Theory, that down there there's a theory of everything, say string theory, that will, by deduction and entailment, entail everything that happens in the universe. That's reductionism, okay? It matters. Max Weber, the early sociologist, so I'm tiptoeing a little bit towards you, who I've never read, except for this one statement, said something amazing. He said, you know what? With Newton, we became disenchanted and entered modernity. I find that statement just utterly profound. What does he mean, disenchanted? Well, if you go back a century before Newton, there's the white magi and the black magi. And the black magi are busy mumbling occult phrases, and the aim is to stand nature on her head and wrest our due from nature. Right? Which, by the way, takes us back to our roots in the Abrahamic religions, to the Old Testament, where God creates all of creation, and he puts Adam, not Eve, this is a male-dominated society, in dominion over all of earth, to use it for his benefit. So this ties into the Gun Institute. We're supposed to use the world for our benefit. Okay, that's our heritage that was 4,900 years ago or something like that. It was pretty good in the early Bronze Age. It's kind of stupid now, okay? We've sort of saturated the planet. Now watch, from Newton we get the Enlightenment. What does the Enlightenment say? It says, down with the clerics, those obscurantist friars, okay? Up with science, namely Newton, for what? The ever betterment of mankind by knowledge and command and control of nature for our ever betterment, which leads to what? The Industrial Revolution, which leads to our enhanced standard of living. We enter modernity, as Weber says. But we become disenchanted. The black magi were enchanted. They thought it would work if they had the right mumbo-jumbo. And so were the white magi, like Kepler. But once you have the mechanical universe of Newton, there's no place for magic. None. You become disenchanted. The largest view of what I think we should be talking about, and I don't know what I mean by it except that I'm in love with the phrase, is maybe we need to move beyond modernity. I don't know what that means, but I think it's part of what we need to be talking about. And that brings me to this work that I'm doing with Giuseppe Longo. Let me tell you what it is and then give you the core arguments of it. Giuseppe and I believe, and I think we're right, that Newton works for physics, but that with life, with the onset of life, there is no law that entails, in the sense of differential equations that you integrate with boundary conditions, there is no law that entails the evolution of life. Furthermore, there's no law that entails the evolution of culture. There's no law that entails the evolution of technology. There's no entailing law. Now, it's going to take me a few minutes to tell you why we think that's true, because it's a big story if it's right. Because if it's right, it says, we reach the end of a physics worldview at the watershed of life. And Heraclitus said 2,500 years ago, the world bubbles forth, which is not an entailment. It's a little bit like God creating everything. And it's not Newtonian, right? It's not an entailment. Well, Heraclitus may be wrong for physics, but I think Heraclitus is right for life. Life bubbles forth. So I want to show you that, because it's going to lead to the following. Not only do we live in a nexus of causes, which we're all familiar with, Newtonian, right? We live in a web of enablement and radical emergence. And policy has to do with enablement. And how do we do it wisely? And I don't think we know how to think about enablement. So I'm going to get us there. And then gripe about the Supreme Court and Citizens United, which I find an atrocious enablement. Okay, so let me give you the core of the argument. First, let me tell you that neither quantum mechanics alone nor classical physics alone suffices to describe real evolution, and it's easy to prove. Mutations can be quantum, indeterminate, random, acausal things. They just happen. Okay? So mutations really can. But the vertebrate eye and the octopus eye are camera eyes, and they're nearly identical with one another. One, they did it right. They have the blood vessels on the inside, and we have them between our photoreceptors and the outside world, which is really dumb, but all vertebrates do. Well, you can't look at the camera eye of an octopus and the camera eye of a human and say that evolution is random. In some sense, it's profoundly non-random, otherwise you wouldn't get something as amazing as the camera eye evolved twice independently. So what does that tell us? It tells us that real evolution is not quantum random, indeterminate alone, but it's not determinate because it's got mutations. But it's not random either. It's neither determinate nor causal in the quantum aspects, nor is it random. It's something new. Life is new, not captured either by quantum mechanics alone or classical physics alone. Just true, okay? And I think it's true of human life as well. Okay, now with that placeholder, let me define a Kantian whole, so you can bet that it's associated with Immanuel Kant. Kant said, an organized being, then, has a property that in it, the parts exist for and by means of the whole, and the whole exists for and by means of the parts. So I'm going to give you a first simple example, okay? And this is some origin of life stuff. Gonan Ashkenazi at Ben Gurion University has a set of 9 small proteins called peptides that are collectively autocatalytic. What I mean by that is each of the peptides catalyzes or speeds up a chemical reaction that takes 2 fragments of one of the other peptides and glues it together, such that all 9 peptides collectively catalyze their own formation. Do you all see it? Okay, let's take the simplest case. I catalyze Puja's formation out of Puja parts. Just 2. Okay. The top of your body and the bottom. And you do the same for me. Now what's magical about this is several things. First of all, Gonan and a guy named Reza Gadiri have proven unequivocally that molecular reproduction does not need to be based on template replication. I'm glad, because I invented the idea of collectively autocatalytic sets in '71 for peptides, and these guys have done it, so I feel kind of good about that. The second is, it's our first case of a kind of functional closure that's going to apply to organizations too. Namely, if we think of catalysis as a task, a catalyst carries out a catalytic task, then the autocatalytic set achieves task closure in a set of catalytic tasks so that the whole thing gets made. Intuitively clear? And you need to make it mathematically precise. Okay. That's a Kantian whole. The whole exists for and by means of the parts, and the parts for and by means of the whole. So they're real in the universe. Gonen's got one in Ben Gurion. Next step is critical to us. Think of one of your skin cells. For example, this one. Well, when it divides, it carries out lots of tasks. Okay, it replicates its DNA, it makes chemosmotic pumps, it makes membranes, it does work cycles. It doesn't do just catalysis, it does mitosis, right? And even if you're not a biologist, you know what all of that stuff is, except maybe chemosmotic pumps. Okay, anyway, the idea is that a cell achieves a closure in some task space. Are we all comfortable with that? It's a little hard to state what it is, but it's some huge task space. And this is going to lead us into the mystery that Giuseppe and I have found ourselves in. And do you all know Brian Beckett in ecology? So Brian and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and Brian said, you know, we don't know how to define a niche. And I said, you're right, Brian, and I'm not even an ecologist. What if we try the idea of task closure to try to define a niche? And he said, that sounds like a neat idea. And then I started thinking about it. So what's the niche of, say, a paramecium that's evolving? I want my thing to be evolving. Some mutations are happening, and it's getting to be a better paramecium in paramecium world. Well, the niche of a paramecium is other living things, like bacteria, parameciums, and frogs, okay? And the abiotic environment. Fine. Now, let this thing be evolving in such a way that it's finding a new way of making a living in its niche. Here's the interesting puzzle. Natural selection is going to select it. Well, I need to say a few things, so let me jump in. We cannot define the niche and the relevant variables of the niche until they're revealed to us by natural selection. We cannot pre-state them. This is along the lines that I talked about last year. So let me back up and show this to you in slightly more detail. It's going to sound really weird. Can anybody in the room tell me all of the uses of a screwdriver? Right. To be a little more precise, the uses of a screwdriver are indefinite in number and unorderable, right? There's not a first use and a second use and a third use like there are integers. That means something mathematical. It means that there's no effective procedure to list all possible uses of a screwdriver. It's not algorithmic, okay? Now let's take one use of a screwdriver, the obvious one being opening a paint can, not screwing in a screw. Just too trivial. It's opening a paint can. Well, how many things or processes can manage to open a paint can? Once again, it's indefinite in number and unorderable, right? So there's no algorithm or effective procedure to list all the things that can accomplish that task. Fair enough? Okay, now let's go to the cell, achieving a task closure. And in some new environment, some parts and processes find a use together such that the cell is fitter in that environment, okay? And if they're heritably variable, they're grafted in by natural selection, operating at the level of the Kantian whole cell into the biosphere. Do you all agree with me? But now notice that you cannot define the task closure in the niche until selection reveals after the fact what that niche closure is, what that task closure is. You cannot say it ahead of time. The task closure in the niche is circularly defined with the task closure in the cell. They're not separately definable. Can you feel it? This means something big. And the way Giuseppe and I are saying it is, in evolution, in physics, you can pre-state the phase space, like Newton's fixed space of space and time. But in biology, and in ecology, and in culture, and in policy, the phase space of the possibilities itself is changing all the time. The phase space is changing. The set of the relevant variables are changing all the time. And you cannot pre-state what they are until they emerge. Okay? For example, there weren't any rabbits 50 million years ago. Now there are rabbits. Well, okay, so there are new things in the world. Facebook wasn't around 50 years ago. It's a new thing in the world, and it's affecting the Arabic Spring. Okay? Now the implication of that is that since you do not know the relevant variables until they've been revealed to you by natural selection acting at the level of the Kantian whole, you can't write down the equations of motion. You can't for billiard balls because you know ahead of time what counts as a thing. It's a billiard ball. But you can't for cells evolving in an environment, in a niche, because you don't know what the relevant features of the thing are that count as the relevant features. Well, I forgot to tell you. The function of your heart is to pump blood. It's not to make heart sounds. So the relevant features are a subset of the causal consequences of something, okay? So taking that into account, we do not know the relevant features of the cell and its environment until it's revealed to us, because it worked in natural selection. Fair enough? That means something huge. It means we cannot write down the equations of motion because we don't know the relevant variables that are going to come to exist. And furthermore, if the niche is like the boundary condition, like the balls of the table for the billiard balls, what did Newton tell us to do? He said, look, write down the equations of motion, the initial conditions, and the boundary conditions, and integrate. But if the niche is the boundary conditions, we don't know the boundary conditions, so even if we had the laws of motions, we couldn't integrate them. In short, this is a very compact way of saying our big conclusion. There is no law that entails the becoming of the biosphere. So Heraclitus is right. Life bubbles forth beyond entailing law. But there is something which is a radical emergence and enablement. So I want to show it to you by mentioning something that I mentioned last year, which are Darwinian preadaptations, and then I'll get beyond this stuff and closer to home with us. So a Darwinian adaptation is the fact that your heart is around because it pumps blood. And if you say, why pumping blood as the function of the heart, as opposed to heart sounds or jiggling water in the pericardial sac, Darwin would say, look, Stu, your ancestors had hearts that pumped blood, and it was selectively advantageous. That's why you've got a heart. Okay? So he'd give a selective account. Fair enough. There's a neat story to tell here that I don't quite have time to tell you, but we can come back to it. He's also explaining why hearts exist in the universe. Most complex things will never exist in the universe. Atoms do, but most organs will never exist. And most Kantian institutes won't exist. I mean, just take a random example. Okay, so a Darwinian pre-adaptation, said Darwin, is, you know what? A functional property of an organ, a causal consequence of an organ, of no selective use in a given environment, might be useful in another environment, so be selected. So I'm going to give just one example of a Darwinian pre-adaptation, which I talked about last year, and do something different with it. Some fish have a sac called a swim bladder, partially filled with air and partially filled with water, a ratio which adjusts neutral buoyancy in the water column. Paleontologists think that these evolved from the lungs of lungfish. And water got into some lungs. Now you got a sac with air and water in it. It's poised to become a swim bladder. And so it does. And so let's say the paleontologists are right. I normally go on and say a bunch of things, but I'm just going to say two right now. First of all, did a new function come to exist in the biosphere? Sure, neutral buoyancy in the water column. Where'd that come from? Something new, a new functionality, came to exist in the universe. It really happened. And it happens all the time. Okay? Do new functions come to exist in technological evolution? Sure, Facebook, or Google, or the web, right? New functions come to exist all the time, and they're not entailed. The next thing I want to say is the following. Well, let's take the swim bladder. This blows me away. I realized it about 3 months ago. See if it knocks your sock off, or both socks, or your shoes. Could a worm or a bacterium come to live in the swim bladder? Sure. Agreed? So the swim bladder is what I'll call a new, adjacent, possible, empty niche. And it opens up a new direction of evolution of the biosphere, because that worm could go off and become whatever. Okay? Okay. Did selection act on a population of fish to make a functioning swim bladder? Well, sure, probably. But did selection act to make the swim bladder as a new adjacent possible empty niche? No, it didn't. Selection wasn't sitting there trying to make a new adjacent possible empty niche. It was trying to make a functioning swim bladder, to anthropomorphize selection a little bit. Okay? Just a little bit. Fair enough? Look what this means, you guys. It means that without selection acting at all, the biosphere is creating its own future possibilities of becoming. It's creating the possibilities of what it'll become with no selection. That just blows my mind. And I think it's true. So, I need one last thing to tell you about this. So I'm going to call that radical emergence. Okay? And I'm going to point out something physical. The way the worm comes to live in the swim bladder is by quantum mutations, which are acausal. That means the niche doesn't cause the worm to come to live in it. It enables it. It makes it possible. Something new is right in front of us that Darwin didn't notice. Okay. We have enablement and radical emergence, and it's happening in the biosphere without any minds. That means that the biosphere is not only a nexus of causes, which it is, it's a nexus of enablement and radical emergence. So we have to think about enablement. Okay, let's jump to the human level. Now we got to worry about consciousness and free will and all that stuff. I happen to think that we're conscious, and I happen to think that we have a responsible free will. And most good neurobiologists think we're not conscious and that we don't have a free will because we have physical deterministic neurons. So we can't have a free will because we're deterministic. So I don't know if most neurobiologists think that, but it's a common view. And it's a big argument, and let's not get into it. Let's just assume we have free will. I think you're all looking at me and I'm looking at you, and we're all perfectly aware of one another. I don't care what anybody else thinks, but we're conscious. Okay. Okay. Let's jump to a next thing. In the case of the Darwinian preadaptation, what I typically go on and say, and said last year, do you think you could say ahead of time, so I'm going to go back, then come forward. Now that I've told you what a Darwinian preadaptation is, do you think you could say ahead of time what all possible Darwinian preadaptations are, just for humans in the next 3 million years? Anybody think so? No, right? That ties to this funny stuff about screwdrivers and not being able to say it. This means something really important, you guys. It means, well, pause. Suppose I flip a coin 10,000 times, and I wonder whether it'll come up heads 5,423 times. Can I calculate it? Sure, binomial theorem. But notice that I knew ahead of time all the possibilities, all heads, all tails, everything in between. I knew the sample space of the process, right? So I could calculate the probabilities. Agreed? But you just agreed that we don't know all possible Darwinian preadaptations that can happen in the next few million years. So we cannot say what I'll call the adjacent possible of the biosphere is by Darwinian preadaptations. We don't know the sample space, right? In the case of the coin, we don't know what will happen, but we know what can happen. We know all the possible outcomes, right? In the case of the biosphere, this is fundamental. Not only do we not know what will happen, we don't know what can happen. Got it? Then reason is an insufficient guide for living your life. You can't reason about that which you cannot know. And reason was the highest virtue of our beloved Enlightenment. Now what are we going to do? But we need all of this because the same thing is true in the evolution of the econosphere. Okay? So I'll just say it fast. The computer got invented, then the mainframe, then the widespread sale of the mainframe created the opportunity for Steve Jobs to invent the personal computer, whose widespread sale enabled and created, hear the word enabled, didn't cause, it enabled, right? The invention of word processing, whose widespread sale enabled sharing files. But the widespread need to share files enabled the invention of the World Wide Web. But the invention of the World Wide Web enabled selling things on the web. Here are all the enableds coming along, okay? It's true. What I just said is right in front of us. It's hiding in plain sight. Once there was a lot of stuff on the web, it enabled Google and Yahoo to become browsers and make a fortune. And now we got Facebook and gosh knows what else. See all these enablements and opportunities happening? But the swim bladder is also an enablement and an opportunity. So you don't need minds. The biosphere is doing it too. Two big implications of this. The first is, if we want to try to do social planning and optimization, and we want to use consequentialist ethics, utilitarianism. Okay, so we all know utilitarianism, Bentham and Mill. So they say, act for the greatest good of the greatest number. Fine. Well, that has a standard problem. Okay, so there's 100 of us, and we're acting for the greatest good of the greatest number. Do we share it equally, or do I get it all? Okay, that's a standard problem with consequentialist ethics. But there's another problem that is ever more upon us, which is, we don't know what the consequences are. If we don't know what the consequences are, what does it mean to be wise? How do we act for the greatest good of the greatest number when we don't know what the consequences are? There's a huge problem, which means that we need another ethic. And there's a start of it in Kant in deontological ethics. You remember he says, act so that the maximum of your action can be universalized. And you say, what are you talking about, Kant? What does it mean to maximize the maximum of your, universalize the maximum of your action? So here's an example. Suppose I say, it's good to tell the truth. Well, Kant would say, if everybody tells the truth, it works. Right? So you can universalize the maximum of your action. Now suppose I say, that's all lie. Well, you can't universalize it because the point of lying doesn't work if everybody lies. So you see what Kant's trying to drive at. So we're all wedded to consequentialist ethics. I don't think it's enough. Okay, so now the next thing I want to say is, not only do we not know what we cause when we cause things, when we enable, we don't know what we enable. And I'm going to give an example that I find horrifying. So, bless them, our founding fathers, copying down the words of John Locke, came up with the Constitution. And it's a superb document, and we all love it. Under the aegis enabled by the Constitution, the enabled by the Constitution is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Citizens United, how long ago? About 10 months ago? Whatever it was. No, it's longer ago than that. A couple of years ago. In Citizens United, what did these, excuse me, comrade, what did these people do? They said a company is a legal person that lives forever. By the way, in 1830, companies were not legal persons that lived forever. Companies that live forever are a creation of the law. This is really important because they can accumulate wealth forever. They don't have to pay estate taxes like we do. And that's part of why wealth is shifting to the big corporations. They never pay estate taxes. They just keep accumulating the money. Anyway, said the Supreme Court, now that they're legal persons, they have the same right of free speech as everybody else. And political free speech includes contributing money. And so Citizens United says corporations can contribute money. So, what did that enable? Well, we know what it's enabled. The money in congressional elections quadrupled on, I was informed, on the NewsHour, or 60 Minutes or something a few weeks ago. Quadrupled between 2006 and 2010. That means that and meanwhile, how's it being handled? Well, the congressman or woman creates a SuperPAC, which creates a non-for-profit organization. Companies can secretly give money to the non-for-profit organization, which can funnel 50% of it directly to the candidate. What just happened to one human being and one vote? We just got raped. Because the corporations are now in extraordinary power, manipulating by argumentation and influence the votes of our representational Congress, let alone lobbying them where they're wired together, let alone, did you know this? This was on 60 Minutes the other night. Did you know that in Congress, people in Congress can do insider trading and it's legal? And that there's even a business inside of Congress selling insider information to the funds and making $100 million a year on it? It's grotesque. Our civilization, our civil society is being stolen from us by evil enablement. Okay? Now with that in mind, let me come closer to home. And I want to show you, something really neat happened to me last year when I was here. I'm in love with what you're trying to do. How can we not be? I mean, you'd have to be a moral fool not to be. And I know that you've been trying for 30 years to do ecological economics. And I know that you've been trying to say things like, would you please put on the price of what it costs to ruin the environment into the cost of a good, fundamentally. That's a very simple statement of a very complex 30-year-old topic, but I understand the basic idea. Bless you and may it work, but it's having a hard time working, even if we get capping, okay? And when I was listening to you, I thought, gosh, why are you buying into the economic paradigm? And people kind of got mad at me, and we all sort of burbled and bumbled and whatever. And I think maybe I'm right. And I want to try to tell you that right at the heart of economics, there's another value than price. So let's now look at this carefully. And it has to do with enablement, because enablements have value, right? If I am Procter & Gamble and I enable the regulations so that the playing field is good for Procter & Gamble, and they try to, okay? They make millions more bucks, so there's real more money associated with this enablement stuff. We're not playing. Nor do we know how to think about enablement and how enablement cascades to other enablement that enables us. We have no framework of thought whatsoever about how to think about this.
Not true.
Oh, we do?
Money.
Oh, money. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, look. So we think that the supreme notion of, we think that the arbiter, well, here's what I want to show you. I want to show you the Edgeworth box. And I want to try to show you that at the heart of the center pillar of economics is not value in terms of price, it's value in terms of something else. And that's what I was upset about but couldn't articulate last year. We think that the only notion of value is price. Okay?
We don't.
I know. I know. But the economists do. Let us say the evil scumbag economists. And I got to tell you that a bunch of my best friends are really good economists, and I really like economics. So let me show you. Do you all know the Edgeworth box? No. Okay. I get to teach you some economics, which is really cool because I'm a biologist. So this is something that's got to be English, okay? Because the guy's name is Edgeworth, and he invented a box that has to do with worth. The worst of this was in England years ago. My wife and I were driving, and there was a funeral parlor called Scratch and Sneer. And I thought, you know, come on, only in England. You know? Anyway, here's the Edgeworth box. So I'm going to use stew and puja. So this is stew, and this is puja. And this is apples. That's supposed to be a square. Apples and pears. This is 0, and this is, I may get this backward. I sometimes do. Anyway, there's the notion from utility theory, from Bentham and Mill, of the utility of apples to puja and pears to puja. Okay? And there's the notion of a trade-off curve. And here's what it looks like. This is puja's trade-off curve, right here. Anywhere along this line, puja is equally happy with whatever that ratio is of apples and pears. It's an iso-utility curve, okay? But she's even happier up here because she's got more apples and pears. And so this whole space is filled with puja iso-utility curves. Now, is this also black or is this another color?
I think it's a different color.
Behind you are different colors.
Hmm?
There should be 2 different on there. I think that's different.
Oh, that's great. But then there's the question of how it comes out. Okay. So, there's also stew iso-utility curves. Now, you may wonder why they're bent the way they are, because it's not accidental at all. Okay? But they're bent the way they are, so the story works. Okay? So, stew is equally happy along any one of these blue lines, but less happy here and more happy here. So I'm happier here, and Puja's happier there. Okay? Now, at the start of the economy, I want us to be here. So this is how many apples stew has, and Puja has the rest. And this is how many pears stew has, and Pooja has the rest. So Pooja's got most of the pears and I got most of the apples. You like pears?
Better than apples.
Me too. Let's trade. Okay. So here's how the story works. It's really lovely. It's truly absolutely lovely mathematically, given the curves. Look, the economy starts here, and Pooja and I are just sitting there with baskets full of pears and apples. There's no production functions going on in the economy. We're just going to trade pears and apples. And she's just next door. It's real easy. I'll just go over into the sunshine. Okay. Notice that if we go into this direction, inside this hatched area, that are between the iso-utility curves, where the economy starts, anywhere inside of this, Pooja's gone uphill, right? She's happier. And I've gone uphill. I'm happier. Isn't that cool? This is the region of the advantages of trade. This is the fundamental analysis in economics, mathematically, of advantages of trade. It is the Edgeworth box. I'll write it down. And this is the regions of, I'm a doctor, so you can't read my writing. Okay, so this is the region of advantages of trade, and it's why we ought to trade. Okay, so we do trade. Now the ratio of pears to apples is price, taking apples as what's called the numeraire, right? That ratio, any spot in here where we trade is a price of apples in terms of pears. Got it? That's price. Fair enough? Okay. So price is to be defined by a point in this space. But something magic happens in the Edgeworth box. See right here, these two curves are tangent to one another. It's kind of by accident. Well, this space is filled with Pooja curves and with Stu curves. So for every Pooja curve, there's a Stu curve that's tangent to it. Right, without my drawing it? You agree?
Yes.
And therefore, across this space, there's a, as we say mathematically, a locus. Makes you feel like you're a mathematician. There's a set of points of tangency where these curves all cross, where these curves are all tangent. Are you all with me? This is really important. And so I'm going to draw it like that. I mean sort of a thick bar. It's actually a one-dimensional line. And that's called the contract curve. Here's where something new enters. On the contract curve, Pooja and I have squeezed out all of the advantages of trade. Can't get any more advantages of trade on the contract curve because where the curves are tangent to one another, there's no space between them to go into. Deep mathematics. Okay, got it? There's no more advantages of trade because of the tangency of the curves. So now the problem's the following. Once we've achieved the contract curve, do we wind up here where Stu's got all the advantages of the trade? Do we wind up here where Pooja's got all the advantages of the trade? Do we wind up in the middle? Economic theory tells you nothing about where you wind up on the contract curve. And more important, different points on this curve are different prices, right? Because each point is a price of apples in terms of pears. Price cannot tell you where you wind up on the contract curve. It can't. So there's another property of this curve. It's called Pareto efficient. And what that means is there's no way of making Pooja happier without making me less happy. Because if we move that way,